Morning, everybody, and welcome to Soundbite. This morning I'm going to be sharing some reflections on Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 to 11. So if you want to get your Bibles out, ready to make reference to that, that would be good. It's actually about Jesus being tested in the wilderness, and I'm going to be sharing some thoughts and some reflections which were shared with me many years ago when I was when I first became a Christian, and they were very helpful to me. And so in the interests of avoiding plagiarism, I'm not claiming original thinking here. I just want to share some stuff which I think might be of help. So let's get stuck into things. Matthew chapter 4 verses 1 to 11 goes like this. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he is hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It's also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour. "All this I'll give you," he said, "if you'll bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. Now, I'd like to start by sharing an ancient story from the Middle East, which really describes something in the lives of most people that we encounter from day to day, and probably has described our own lives at some point. And it goes like this. One day, long ago, over the hot sands of a Middle Eastern country, a white skylark flew in joyous loops about the sky. As she swooped near the earth, she heard a merchant cry out, "Worms, worms, worms for feathers, delicious worms." The skylark circled about the merchant, hungry at the mention of worms, but puzzled by what the merchant meant. Little did the skylark know that the merchant was in fact the devil. And seeing that the little skylark was interested, the devil motioned her nearer. "Come here, my little friend. Come and see the lovely worms I have." Cautiously, ever so cautiously, the skylark landed and cocked her head at the merchant. "Come, taste the juicy worms." The skylark became aware that she was indeed quite hungry, and these worms looked bigger and tastier than any she had ever dug for herself out of the hard-baked ground of the desert. The skylark hopped closer and put her beak up close to a worm. "2 worms for a feather, my friend. 2 worms for one." The skylark was unable to resist, and she had, after all, so many feathers. So, with a swift motion, she pulled out a feather, just a small one, from beneath her wing and gave it to the merchant. "Take your pick, my little friend, any 2 your heart desires." And so the skylark quickly snatched up 2 of the plumpest worms and swallowed her meal with great delight. Never before had she tasted such wonderful worms, and with a loud chirrup she leapt into the air and resumed her joyful flight. Day after day the skylark returned, and the merchant always had wonderful worms to offer. Black ones and blue ones, red ones and green ones, all fat and shiny and iridescent. But one day, after eating her fill, the skylark leaped into the air, but to her horror she fell to the ground with a thud. She was unable to fly. All at once, with a shock, she realised what had happened. From the delicious worms she had grown fatter and fatter, and as she plucked her feathers one by one, first her body, then her tail, and finally her very wings had grown bolder and bolder. Horrified, she remembered how slowly, imperceptibly, day by day, it had been getting harder and harder to fly, and how she'd told herself it was no matter. She could always stop. It was not too late. Now here she was, trapped on the ground. She looked up and saw the merchant looking at her, a grin spreading across his face. In terror, the Skylark ran off into the desert. She ran and ran, and it took her hours and hours. Never in her entire life had she run so far. And finally she came to the softer ground near the desert springs where before she met the merchant, she had daily come to dig for herself the small, dusty brown desert worms that could be found around the springs. The Skylark dug and dug in a frenzy. She piled up worm after worm until it was nearly dark. Then, wrapping her catch in a small, fallen palm frond, she dragged it off back to the merchant, closing his stall for the night. The skin around her beak had grown bruised and tender. Her small feet were bleeding from the great distance she had been forced to walk. Oh merchant, please help me, please help me. I cannot fly any more. Oh dear, what shall I do? Please, please, take these worms from me and give me back my feathers. The merchant bent down and peered at the terrified Skylark. Throwing back his head, he roared with laughter. Oh, I'll take those worms all right, my friend. But feathers, he laughed again. What will you do with those? Glue them back on. Besides, that's not my business, feathers for worms. Oh no, my business is worms for feathers. The merchant reached down, plucked the Skylark from the desert floor, and slammed her into a little cage, and with a loud snap of his fingers, vanished into the desert air. We need to understand that God made us to fly in freedom like the little Skylark. Temptation is the power of evil to rob us of that freedom and to lead us bit by bit into bondage. I'm convinced that in our Western culture, the compulsive nature of temptation yielded to again and again is one of the biggest pastoral and missional issues facing the church today. A recent survey by the Office for National Statistics revealed that 60% of UK adults think it's fine for people to binge drink over the festive season. 23% of adults have a drink to cheer themselves up when they feel a bit low, and 14% use alcohol to give themselves Dutch courage before work or a social event. 2 in 5 drink before making love or to relax and to help lose their inhibitions. And every year in the UK there are 33,000 deaths from alcohol or alcohol-related diseases. Then there's pornography. A recent survey indicated that 40 million US citizens regularly access internet pornography, many of whom are addicted. The list of recreational temptations that afflict modern Western societies is endless and spans everything from shopping to eating to drugs to sex to working to fitness to gambling. What begins as a harmless activity leads many into the exchange of feathers for worms until there is complete loss of freedom and total dependency on our attachments. To make us feel better about this dependency, we're constantly being told that it's okay, that it's normal, that it's fun, and that you're worth it. And in many cases, this is true. But this is the insidious nature of compulsive behaviour for a large slice of the population, and these things can lead to a deadening dependency and a gradual loss of freedom. Never before has the merchant in our story had so many outlets to sell worms for feathers. In fact, he's now open for business 24 hours a day. If ever the good news of Jesus Christ was relevant to our culture, it's in restoring the freedom of the Skylark to the millions of people enslaved to the consequences of their unbridled attachments. Unfortunately, we within the church are often unable to bring the good news to the folk around us because, quite frankly, we're as much enslaved as they are. No wonder St. Paul exclaims in Romans 7 verse 24, What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body of death? And it's into this wretched situation that Jesus walks. Now, referring back to Matthew chapter 4, in verse 1, it says that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the desert to be tempted by the devil. Right at the start of his ministry, Jesus, like the skylark, is taken into the desert to meet with the merchant, and immediately the merchant starts his bargaining. In verse 3, he says, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." The merchant knows that Jesus is starving hungry from 40 days without food. What a great opening shot. How often does the merchant point out to us our legitimate needs and ask us to have them fulfilled in illegitimate ways? And so often in our human frailty we give in. Yes, I'm feeling lowly, I'll go on that chat line. Yes, I'm feeling low, I'll raid the fridge, or I'll have that extra beer. Yes, I'm feeling insecure, I'll spend some more money on that new motorcycle part to boost my ego. Yes, merchant, you can sell me what I need. Here are my feathers. Jesus knows exactly how we feel, but rather than buy bread from the merchant to satisfy his hunger, he rebukes him and sends him packing. Jesus knows that his Father has called him to fast and to feel his hunger and to trust in his Father's ultimate provision and not indulge in short-term fulfillment. The merchant is undeterred and takes Jesus to the pinnacle of the temple overlooking the Kidron Valley, and in verse 6 issues another challenge. If you are the Son of God, notice, if you are the Son of God, he constantly tries to undermine our identity. Anyway, he says, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone. The merchant knows that Jesus hasn't yet proved himself in ministry. Perhaps in his humanity, Jesus feels slightly insecure. How often does the merchant point to our own insecurities and ask us to bolster them in illegitimate ways? And again, so often in our human frailty we give in. Yes, I am feeling insecure. I'll work that extra bit hard this week to prove my worth. Yes, I'm feeling insecure. I'll do that thing, or buy that thing, or seek that person who'll make me feel less insignificant. Yes, merchant, you can sell me what I need. Here are my feathers. Jesus knows exactly how we feel, but rather than prove himself in some ego-driven stunt, he again tells the merchant to get lost and sends him on his way. Jesus knew that his mission would be significant, but not by making his ego centre stage. Once more, the merchant plies his wares. He takes Jesus to a high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour, and in verse 9 makes the following bargain. All this I will give you if you bow down and worship me. The merchant knows that Jesus has come to rescue the kingdoms of all the world, and now he offers Jesus a shortcut to that goal. How often does the merchant offer us a shortcut to our God-given goals? And so often in our human frailty we give in. Yes, merchant, a little bit of dishonesty here, a white lie, a little bit of manipulation, telling the truth. We put that on hold. It won't harm anyone as long as it helps me reach my goals. Yes, merchant, can you sell me what I need? Here are my feathers. Jesus knows exactly how we feel, but instead of taking a shortcut to his goal, he rebukes the merchant. Instead, he takes the hard road, the long, hard road to significance, the one that demands much self-sacrifice rather than short-term gain. Now, don't misunderstand me here. The fact that Jesus succeeded in beating the merchant 3 times is not meant to make us feel guilty or a failure. We all know how weak we can be and how easy it is to enter into the devil's bargains. In fact, it's only after the event that often we recognise that we've been played. We all know how often we sell our feathers and our true freedom to the merchant. In fact, it's far too easy to feel a failure. And the more we feel we've failed, the more defeated we can become, and the more likely we are to go back to the merchant for another fix. can be a vicious circle that can lead us into a very dark place. However, Jesus didn't encounter the merchant in the desert 3 times to make us feel guilty. He didn't even encounter him 3 times to show us a method for defeating him. We can get so caught up in coming up with little schemes for trying to beat the merchant in the desert. If I just do this, if I just do that, then I won't give in. No, Jesus met with the merchant in the desert to show us a way to beat the merchant, neither to shame us into trying to beat him. Jesus met with the merchant in the desert to defeat him for us. And that is not a work of ours, that is a work of pure grace. And please hear me and understand this, it's very important, I think. Jesus does want us to be free from our unhealthy attachments. He does want us to live in perfect freedom. But far more important than this is the simple fact that Jesus has already defeated the merchant in the desert, and he calls us simply to live in the freedom of this truth. He has beaten the merchant in the desert, and he has decided to call his victory our victory. He has beaten the merchant in the desert, and he has forgiven us for giving our feathers away. Yes, he does want to show us how to get our feathers back, and yes, he does want to teach us to fly again, and these things are the work of a lifetime. But underneath all of that is the simple fact that we are forgiven, and that the merchant is actually defeated. And like I say, this is a work of pure grace. The primary reason we become so dependent on our attachments is that we lack attachment. Jesus' love and grace is a whole new world of loving attachment that can displace the unhealthy ones. But the kind of love and grace can only be received, never earned, and never strived for. The first stage of our freedom from the merchant is to receive this pure gift of grace. We are forgiven and our future is guaranteed. There is nothing we have to do. When we can grasp and receive this fact, we are ready to receive our flight back. As long as we're trying to do it ourselves and by our own ingenuity and strength, we will fail to receive this gift. Never forget, God made us to fly, and no matter what state we are in, he can and will make us fly again if we surrender to him. This is good news. In fact, if you're struggling and trapped in unhealthy patterns of behaviour and unhealthy thought processes, it brings real light into your darkness. This is the reason for our hope in Christ. In fact, this really is our message for a world trapped in bondage to the merchant in the desert. I'll leave it there. I hope you have a good week. I hope this helps. And if you ever want to talk anything through, if this has brought stuff up for you, feel free to get in touch with us at Sigma Cuthberts. Cheers, God bless, have a great week.